Yes. All right, now I'll take it. Yes. Hello. Welcome back from lunch. How nice to see you all. I know you're excited. I am too. Somebody asked me, how'd you get Cohen? And I said, are you kidding? Cohen has been a friend of the center since we formed it in, even before we formed it, like 2019, or 21, did you come here? Yeah, 21, yeah, absolutely. So, are you kidding? We go way back. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen is the Dean of Humanities at Arizona State University and former co-president of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, the largest professional organization in the environmental humanities. His research examines strange and beautiful things that challenge the imagination, phenomena that are alien and intimate at once. Cohen is widely published in the fields of medieval studies, monster theory, and the environmental humanities. His book, Stone, An Ecology of the Inhuman, received the 2017 Renee Wellick Prize in Comparative Literature from the American Comparative Literature Association. In collaboration with Lindy Elkins Tanton, he co-wrote the book Earth, a re-examination of our widest home from the perspectives of a planetary scientist and a literary humanist. With environmental humanities scholar Stephanie Foote, he co-edited the Cambridge Companion to Environmental Humanities. With Julian Yates, he co-wrote Noah's Archive, which just came out like last year? Yeah, last year. And let's not forget my favorites, of course, Monster Theory, On Giants, and Medieval Identity Machines. Those are my favorites. He's written, and this is a quote, if you'll bear with me. I have spent my career thinking and writing about the transformative power of narrative, the fear and desire that monsters elicit, the joy of studying as well as inventing languages, geology's invitation to inhuman timeframes, the continued vitality of the past in solving the most difficult problems of the present. I have worked relentlessly for renewed reverence for the natural world and environmental justice. I am restless for a mended world, invoking what we Jews call tikkun olam. But you know all that. I'm going to take a page out of Asa Mittman's introductory spiel. I'm going to steal your spiel a little bit, Asa, if you don't mind. Not only do you know all that, but you all know his work like the back of your hand. I know who I'm talking to, monster scholars. If you're anything like me, you've memorized the 7 Theses, written some of your own, and force-fed it to every student you could find. Some of my students are here, and having been force-fed hey, great, hey, good to see you. The fact of the matter is that Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's unceasingly outstanding scholarly labor, and I might also say his friendliness, his camaraderie, his joie de vivre, his bonhomie, have created monster studies and nurtured it into what it is today, 30 years after the publication of Monster Theory. It's because of Jeffrey Jerome Cohen that there is a Center for Monster Studies, a festival of monsters, and a director to introduce him at it. In fact, you might say, and you would not be wrong, that I have arranged the last 10 years of my life so that I could be introducing him right now. So please, the warmest welcome for the progenitor of our field, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen.
Isn't Michael the best? Let's all give him another round. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And I hope that we can start today by thanking everyone who's made today happen. It's been a seamlessly run conference. It's been incredible. Michael, Renee, all the staff, all the volunteers. So a round of applause for everyone who made it happen. And I also want to thank every presenter who's presented here. I've learned so much in your company. I've seen you bring all of your passion and your insight, and I've really enjoyed it. I wonder, is there anyone in the audience for whom this conference was the first one they ever presented at? Stand up for a minute, because we owe you a round of applause for your bravery. I also want to recognize, and I'm sorry to embarrass you this way, Gina and David are teachers who've come here. They teach 10th grade. They've brought monster theory to their high school students. They're doing the most important work that can be done at the level it needs to be done. Gina and David, would you mind standing so we can thank you for your work? Finally, as a way into this, I want to just share with you a story that helped me to think that maybe what I'm going to talk about today might be on the right track, not the wrong track. So I was in the car going from the San Jose airport to here, and the driver, Keith, was a man, he said he was in his mid-80s. He seemed to have been someone who lived many lives. He had been a real estate developer. He talked about at one time in his life driving in a cherry red Jaguar, that he was in LA. He'd done stuff in the entertainment industry. He'd lost all of his money. He moved to Santa Cruz without a cent. He lived in a trailer for a while. He kind of remade his life and now lives in a cabin in the woods. And sometimes, just for fun, he doesn't need to do it, drives people back and forth to the airport. But what really made him happy, and it was when I told him where I was going for this conference on monsters, what really made him happy was at the age of 72, he discovered he could sing. And the thing that he gets the most happiness from, and that he really wanted to share with me, is that the Senior Opportunity Center, I think that I have that right, here in Santa Cruz, every Halloween does a Halloween production of a musical version of Frankenstein. And he gets to be Frankenstein, and he sings The Doors' People Are Strange. And he says when he's up there being Frankenstein and singing this song that he had to wait until age 72 to learn that he even had the voice for, and being in the body of the monster and performing that somehow he feels he's never been happier. It had nothing to, he was unhappy with the money, he was unhappy with that part of his life, but being in performance, being in a place of monstrosity that allowed him to flourish, has really been it all. And for him to gift me with that story, I'm like, Keith, I'm going to tell this story to the audience. But I feel like it's worth having. And I just want to ask as a question, because I'm curious about this, having seen the variety of papers that have been given here, how many people in the audience think that if they think about their relationship toward monsters and what drew them to think and to study about them, feel like monsters have opened possibilities for them that might not otherwise have been there if they hadn't studied them? Interesting. I mean, obviously for me, they helped me to forge a career, and I'm eternally grateful. For that reason, my tack today is a little bit different from the other two keynotes, which really were about monsterization and the ways in which the human can move into the category of the monster, but still be human. I think as David Livingston Smith made clear when he quoted Father Patrick Desbois at the end, as much as we would like to see those who commit genocide as being inhuman, even as they monsterize others, right? They move people into a category that's still human, and those who commit genocide, unfortunately, are humans, and they're our neighbors. And Father Patrick Desbois, I once went to a talk that he gave, and he's someone who's worked extensively to recover bodies from the Holocaust by bullets and has investigated genocide. He said, as far as he could tell, really the biggest trigger to genocide after all the ideology has been circulating is opportunity. And too often it's because that's a part of us being human that we are prone to some violences that we think that we're not. And for him, it was like, he's always insisted that unless we can recognize that many of the things that we do are human rather than monstrous, we're never going to make the human more humane. Now, I believe in that deeply. I do believe in that, and you'll share a little bit about that thinking today. Okay, so we live in a time of monsters. It has ever been so. About 30 years ago, I composed a preface to a collaborative project exploring what might happen when the monster is taken seriously.
Might the monster offer an invitation to understanding the complexities of the cultures that it sanctions, perturbs, and roams? I began that long ago preface, you can see it up here a little bit, with a catalog of dire contemporary events, really just taken from news stories at the time. They had to do with war and the obliteration of life, the cold limits we place on family, kin, the natural and the normal, the expulsion from shared humanity of the questioner, the heretic, and the queer, friends and neighbors now imagined as a danger to a nation that figures itself as imperiled in order to foster civic compliance. Almost 3 decades later, any of us in this room could with ease create a version of that same list. We'd likely add terms like illegal immigrant, radical leftist, gender ideologue. Also included would be academics who write and teach about topics like critical race, challenges of identity formation, inclusion, belonging, monsters. 30 years on, the political impulse to monsterize as a way to delimit the boundaries of community has in no way abated. Beneath the monsterized are stories of a humanity we chose to exclude. Also, this is such a time traveler, right? Jurassic Park was new. Yes. And the line that I've taken the most grief for is saying that Jurassic Park would be better if all the kids died in it, but yeah. All right. But that preface was also haunted by enduring and repeating monsters with even more complicated narratives. Aliens who abduct, vampires who arouse, fear that is difficult to discern from attraction. The monster's incessant motion is clear through its path, the archive of its abandoned traces. The monster persists in its vanishing, in its enduring love of sudden escape and startling return. For what is the Yeti or the Sasquatch but the medieval wild man, if not the biblical and the classical giant? I'll return to these ideas in a moment, but just to give you an example of, the monster as a monster in motion as opposed to, say, a natural phenomenon. Jaws is having its 50th anniversary this year, and I don't know, it's really cool. That movie has been around for so long. I encourage you all to rewatch it, and you'll get some insight into monster theory. I think I was way too young when I saw that movie, and it implanted itself on me, and a lot of my thinking about it, a lot of my thinking about monsters owes things to that shark that is not an animal. Right? That shark is, we witness in that movie an animal becoming a monster, because it no longer has anything to do with the shark in nature. Great white sharks are nothing like what's depicted there. There are 180 shark monster movies that followed from this one, including 6 that feature sharks and tornadoes. But what I really love about this moment in the movie, it's when the protagonist sees the shark for the first time and says, we're going to need a bigger boat. Because that shark defies all category, right? And I think about that as the moment of realizing it's a monster. We're going to need a larger category that can capture this thing because we're inadequate to the task. I think that gets it just right. By the way, if you're interested in Jaws and its history, there's a great series of 5 radio labs on it. And they interviewed me on monster theory as part of it. It was so much fun. So sharks as monsters is a theme in that. Anyway, what is the monster shark of Jaws, if not the mechanistic sibling of Scylla, Charybdis, Leviathan, Moby Dick? Why do so many cultures have their own version, beloved as well as feared, of the dragon, the ghost, and the walking dead? They're not in every culture, but many, many cultures has a version of all 3 of those monsters. What if the monster is moving us toward a universal language that can be known only through vibrant dialects and idioms that resist translation, but beckon all the same? More than anything, though, monsters are good humanists. Let me say what I mean by that. They seek story. Vampires, for example, from Bram Stoker and Sheridan Le Fanu to Anne Rice, to Ryan Coogler, to Stephen Graham Jones, are epistolary creatures spawning letters that cross time and space, that engender media from wax cylinders to memoir, recorded and inscribed interviews, PDFs, flurries of email, exchanges of song, hidebound manuscripts. Admittedly, other dead seek stories' end, but in doing so generate ever more narrative. Who knew that death could be so garrulous? An undying love of narrative ensures unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that unquiet earth. Vampires also love literary citationality. Stoker's seminal Dracula is a novel about a fever for archives and a hunger for letters as bearers of compelling stories. No wonder more than 700 vampire novels and films follow in its wake. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, Dracula is the literary character most resurrected through adaptation over time. Writers like Anne Rice and Stephanie Meyer have enabled the allure of the vampire to triumph over its danger, and that's a familiar arc for monsters. Each of these vampires is bound to a specific cultural moment. That is the stake that pins the undead into its engendering place. Even if vampires are found worldwide and across time, from New Zealand to contemporary LA to ancient Egypt, each vampiric reappearance in its analysis no doubt belongs to that time. But such prisons don't hold. Monster Studies knows that it imagines wholes from fragments. And do you really want the monster to stay in its place? Stop hounding you, stop striving to drain your life or your resources or your dreams, as if the monster really could stand still, freeze into position, legible embodiment of a certain time, feeling, and place. Zeitgeist is literally a time ghost, a totalized world. Everything stuck, a photograph without depth, clock at a standstill. But in the end, freeze framing in order to comprehend a whole imagines everything but time standing still. Temporality, like story, only speeds up or slows down or becomes recursive. It doesn't halt. Likewise, the monster's amalgamative body quickens and quickens again with fear, desire, anxiety, fantasy, a life that seeks more life, an uncanny independence, even when the stake is through the heart. The monster insists in being read. It's a narrative in search of ardent readers, and there are always ardent readers. Like letters, words, images, tropes from a book or from a screen, the monster is always something beyond its first glimpse, always a past in the process of presencing itself so it can continue to be born. These spaces of thick temporality offer a principle of uncertainty, the essence of an uncanny vitality, the reason the monster will forever rise from the coffin, grave, or dissection table, striding back to its beloved night. Who can resist the invitation to follow? Monsters offer strange community, and there is a power in sympathetic congregation. If I have a tendency to wax poetic about monsters, I want to reassure you that I speak from long years of experience in their company. Monsters taught me how to become the people I have been over my career and life. My childhood dreams were rife with ghosts, giants, cosmic invaders, sharks that defied the laws of nature, dinosaurs that defied the laws of time, and zombies that disregarded death's finality. Sometimes their fierce interrogations signified trauma, at other times heritage, sometimes doors locked and bolted, and at other times a portal to expanded horizon. I've come to understand that narrative is the most dangerous technology we humans have ever invented, and the first to jump containment, to infect with promiscuity as well as exuberance, a force that builds or destroys worlds. Through novels, poems, comic books, film, and television, I devoured stories of golems that incarnate justice gone wrong, devils that seize human bodies, sea serpents that swallow at the sea's edge, wide-eyed visitors from far-flung realms, subterranean creatures, orcs, goblins, balrogs, sandworms, werewolves, cyclops, mutants, mummies, the walking dead. Was an avid reader with a taste for tales from the past. Later in life, I trained myself with varying success to read an array of languages no longer spoken by the living. And the fact that every cultural tradition to which I was drawn had produced numerous tales with vibrant monsters isn't lost on me. As the culmination of my doctoral research, I almost can't believe I went to graduate school compelled by my obsession with monsters and wanted to study to be a medievalist because the Middle Ages has so many amazing monsters to it. I composed a thesis entitled The Tradition of the Giant in Early England, a study of the monstrous in folklore, theology, history, and literature. I had the good luck to work with two people who didn't care for it at all, and so they signed off a year before it was done and let me just do my thing. On the one hand, I appreciate that freedom. On the other, it would have been nice to have had some attention and some nurturing as part of the project. I found in giants a monster quite literally too big to ignore, and yet few previous scholars had spent much time contemplating their ilk. Giants are monsters that repeat, and most cultures possess a version of them. The giant is a body enlarged to the point at which the human becomes estranged from itself. Looming over our diminished form, the giant makes evident our frailty, our smallness of scale, our hubris when we think the world is ours. Giants elicit terror, but some giants offer an invitation to pleasures that bind us to our luxuriant animality. Indulgence in the consumption of food, surrender of selfhood to the boundary breaking of sensuous enjoyment. The giant is an ambivalent monster, combining fear of self-annihilation with an undercurrent of desire, forces of domination with possibilities of celebration and indulgence, the solidification of the human, but also its dissolution. Because only size need distinguish giants from humans, the line separating these groups is easily traversed. Even when giants are imagined as a separate monstrous race, humans intermingle with them. The biblical Goliath is a Philistine. The Cyclops Polyphemus is famous for his love of a normally proportioned woman. Murderous Cain was sometimes held to be the father of monsters, including giants. Medieval Norse giants, the Jotnar, are often lovers for gods and human. And the offspring of giants are often depicted as normally proportioned. For all their monstrous excess, giants are in the end hard to tell from the humans who insist that giants are monsters, but love getting drunk in their good company. The monster offers a convergence point and transport device. And transport device is actually a really good translation of the Greek word metaphor, or metaphorein. It's a really just transport device, any vehicle. To think creatively and capaciously across time, language, genre, and culture. Early in my scholarly career, it seemed like the only space to which the monster would not accompany me was to secure employment. I was working on a subject that struck many academics as deeply unserious, unworthy of sustained regard. But monsters also taught me how to be stubborn, how to keep circling back, to challenge epistemological limits in the hope of fostering more open communities. Shortly after I completed my dissertation, I gathered a group of scholars to think about monsters together and imagine a discipline that might be called monster studies. It was a cry for company. To find scholars working on monsters was a difficult task enough, but it was even harder to convince those within that small group to respond to an email, or this was 30 years ago, a letter, an actual letter, possibly even done on a print matrix, like printer that came out, and take it seriously. I was no one, I had no pedigree, I was asking people to participate in a project that didn't have a publisher, there was no guarantee of it going anywhere. Also realized at the same time, and far too belatedly, that Rosemary Garland Thompson was working on a similar project on freaks in the very same city as I was, but we hadn't yet met. So those two projects wound up being in parallel, and the same with Jack Halberstam working on Victorian monsters, and we just didn't know each other. There was no convergence point. In time, I gathered an enthusiastic group, and Monster Theory Reading Culture was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 1996. Nearly 3 decades after its launch, Monster Theory remains in print, generating fascinating new writings within a field its contributors helped to launch as one of its multitudinous and polyamorous parents. The essay I wrote to frame the collection is Monster Culture, 7 Theses. It's enjoyed an especially lively reception, thriving in registers as varied as first-year writing courses, blogs, podcasts, internet memes, as well as a spur to art and academic analyses with thousands of citations on Google Scholar for its print and electronic forms. It's been translated into Portuguese, Spanish, French, German, Italian, Japanese, and Hungarian, and in many cases across the internet, simpler English than the florid prose that I composed it in. For a long time, I was extremely apologetic of the fact that it seems almost defensively written with its love of big words and hard language. But what I came to understand after talking to, especially to teachers who teach it in first-year writing and in high school, that the simplified version of it is actually less helpful, and that part of learning to be a good humanist is staying with the aggravation and the struggle of having to work with a dictionary, having to master what words mean. Like there's a real payoff to being with difficult writing. And I had to learn that for myself. When I wrote it, I admit I was being overly defensive. To give you an idea of where the essay has traveled, this is just from Google Scholar, some of the fields that have done things with the essay. And you can see it's an extremely wide range. I'll tell you one other surprising thing. It also brought me to a couple of places I wouldn't have expected, but I'm delighted that I went to. One was I was an expert witness on a copyright infringement case that was launched against Monsters, Inc. There's a 1960s psychedelic artist who claimed that he invented Mike Wazowski because nobody else had done green monsters with a head, and that's the head that is the body. And I was charged as a scholar to say how well precedented that is throughout history. And there are plenty of monsters like that. And I know there was about $5 billion riding on this case, so but it was super fun to do it and to see the impact in the real world that what could be boring scholarship could actually have. The other was has anyone seen the series Penny Dreadful? Yeah, it's pretty good. The writer of that series, writer and producer, I believe, had read Monster Theory while he was in college, and as a gay young man, thought that it gave him a way to belong, but also gave him a frame for monsters. So I was invited to talk to some of the people working on it. It was just super fun to see how that world works. Okay. A creature of story, the monster in a way marshals the full force of the humanities. The collaborative project that is Monster Theory released into the world some ideas that traveled, mutated, and adapted for changing times. These transmutations and inspirations show no signs of slowing down as the 30th anniversary of the book's publication approaches next year. Considering the success of Monster Theory and of monster studies more generally, many are surprised when I tell them about the risk that the University of Minnesota Press took in publishing the volume. There always seems to be something embarrassing about monsters, as if they were an enthusiasm and not a scholarly project. In his really excellent introduction to the Ashgate Research Companion to Monsters and the Monstrous, 2012, a volume whose very title would seem to announce that monster studies is as respectable a field as academia offers. Asa Simon Mittman writes of being urged as a graduate student to stop working on monster stuff and undertake real scholarship. Many of us whose work now belongs in this field that we couldn't name at the time have similar tales. Monster Culture, 7 Theses, and Monster Theory came about from my frustration at research obsessions not being valued. Monster Culture is a letter to the future, to a solidarity that I hope might someday coalesce. The project was born at a challenging juncture. Monsters always seem to come at a crossroads. I'd finished my doctoral degree and was appointed in a limited-term part-time position while adjuncting elsewhere. The clock was ticking, and I didn't seem to have a reasonable expectation of landing a permanent gig, but also was just disappointed at not having companions to be with, to think about these projects with, and I wanted to see if that were possible to create. So I thought of the book almost as a goodbye to a humanities that had reached its limit at the welcome of the monster, a figure always at the gate, but never in the home for long. Monster Theory was an attempt to realize an unlikely welcome by gathering scholars across disciplines into colloquy. No one owns a monster, and no monster has an exact origin, but by affixing a scholarly mantle to the study of a subject too often thought below consequential regard, at the limit of the human, but also at the limit of what the humanities could admit, the book, when published by a respected academic press, announced unapologetic study. Monster Theory assisted those who wanted to work on monstrous figures to argue that the research and analysis that they undertook in the monstrous company is valuable knowledge, insight that advances how we understand what it means to be human, how to live more humanely in a perilous world. Well, this out as a footnote. Actually, the book didn't do very well at all at first, and it took a very far-sighted acquisitions editor who replaced the one that I worked with, realizing that there was this thing called electronic books that might be a big thing. And this was the first electronic book that was released by University of Minnesota Press. And it was just when they were about to take the book out of print, but by making it more accessible to more people, it traveled like crazy. So it was really an access question. Anyway, today the bibliography of monster studies is extensive, as are the scholarly gatherings that welcome the monstrous. Here are a few. A collective of medievalists formed Merkstapper, Monsters, the Experimental Association for the Research of Cryptozoology through Scholarly Theory and Practical Application. That is a mouthful. Yeah, Asa, well done with that one. But I want to mention their mission statement declares, and I always find this so inspirational, we affirm that there can be no community without crossing borders, no love without risk. The Société Monstre de Montréal publishes the academic journal, Monstrum. You, Melissa and Yiwo, and Amanda J. Hobson have launched the series Palgrave Studies in Monstrosity to explore beings and groups who have been monstered, othered, and otherwise pushed to the margins. The University of Santa Cruz has a Center for Monster Studies, founded by the inimitable Michael Chemers. The center's motto, we take monsters seriously. But I love that title too. We take monsters seriously. That's such a profound and assertive declaration, right? So much. And it wasn't an easy one to make. Monsters are always on the move because they welcome the imagination, invite curiosity, and open the very doors they're supposed to guard, a summons to perilous play. Although each monster arrives formed or deformed by the temporal, cultural, linguistic, and community specificity from which it arises, to the monster belongs a body that's both particular but also transhistorical. The monster arrives in the present, yearning to impart an old story, a narrative from the deep past. Though today often associated with science fiction and futurity, monsters are also prehistoric, ahistoric, and innate anachronisms. They arrive to account a lesson in the complexities of temporality. Monsters are charged with patrol of the borders that demarcate identities, but they confound stabilities instead. They are the guest we welcome and the wrecker of homes, ethical admixtures that challenge the easy lines that propriety assumes but cannot sustain, a reaction that is also its confounding opposite, an overwhelming sensation that finds expression only in self-contradictory terms, hybridity that doesn't offer coherent totality. The monster always escapes, always vaults into heraldic motion because it arrives where categorization falters, insufficient to its task. Monstrous irresolution demands a rethinking of boundary and normalcy because the monster refuses compartmentalization, refuses the stilled simplicity that taxonomy provides. We're as likely to encounter the monster in a basement or bedroom of a safe home. I think the film Weapons works so well because of its warped meditation on welcome, family, hospice, and hospitality, as at the margins of the known world's geography or in outer space. Forever moving between a harbor and harbinger, refuge and force, the monster is perilous provocation and rebuke to boundary and enclosure. Monsters therefore invite curiosity, a desire that kills far more than cats, but also elicits care. Can we be forgiven for loving the monster when it arrives as messenger, declaring that our categories were always too narrow, that binaries and bifurcations are lethal to those who cannot safely abide in the ease of an either-or? Monsterization is a deadly process of forcing fellow humans into categories where they become expendable, killable, not worth a thought. But after such exile, what an impoverished fortress is left to those who remain within, a precarious harbor limned by companions made strange. No wonder the remaining citizens feel constantly endangered. The walls around their security are thin and built on hostility, on expulsion of kin, leaving a lingering knowledge that any citizen can be the next to be identified as a monster and a danger. No wonder some from that fortress, built on exclusion, will set off through the gates and into the uncertain night, sometimes finding shelter and unexpected community. These refugees from a polity too enamored of its own imagined purity do not always find the end of their human life, as they were warned by their fellow citizens, but the beginnings of a more humane way of dwelling in a difficult world. Though it can be marshaled as a tool by petty tyrants to buttress the very injustices through which monsters are formed and exiled, crisis can also offer a suspended space where better futures are imagined and more capacious collectivities affirmed. When categories prove inadequate to their task of keeping civilization immune to change, the monster's already on the move, already in flight, or waiting at another gate. We want our utopias back. If words like astonishing, awesome, terrible, and sublime still retain their ability to push human experience outside of small parameters, these would be the terms that would walk alongside the monster. Messenger of the utter contingency upon which category rests, herald of freedom terror and desire fear, the monster is the limit of the human who invites us beyond the limitations of what it is to be merely human. No wonder, then, that the discipline of monster studies has to date found its subject to be inexhaustible to study. The monster summons us to contemplate the intransigence and even the incoherence at the heart of what it means to be ourselves. Don't get me wrong, it's easy to love the monster too much, or to love the monster for its violence alone, its endless appetite for chaos, its will to havoc. Much of the time, though, such destruction-loving monsters turn out to be tiresomely human. Let me put this another way. A quote that has been circulating quite frequently over the past few years attests that we live in a time of monsters. You've no doubt seen it, heard it. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. This ominous aphorism is often cited admiringly for its uncanny insight into the zealous lurch and extremist lean of recent global politics. And the chilling words are typically cited to invoke uncanny parallels between today and the 1930s, when, as a world war raged, Antonio Gramsci, writing in notebooks smuggled into his prison cell, noted something about transitions and intermediacy. It seems to be a fundamental and recurring truth about monsters. What's amazing is that Gramsci didn't write that, and it's based on a very loose French translation of Gramsci's Italian that Slavoj Žižek launched into the world. But what really, so it's really not from the prison notebooks at all, and it really has not much to do with the 1930s, except as like a hint of a whiff of a little bit of it. But what I love about it is the way that we keep repeating it, because I think we don't want to live in a time that doesn't have monsters in it. But having said that, I think there's a degree to which we sometimes misuse the term. When we include in the company of monsters autocrats and oligarchs, are we not disparaging the eloquent potency and enigmatic possibility of the monsters? These men seem to me the pettiest and most predictable version of what it means to be a human enamored of power, more tedious than monstrous, more banal than category challenging, figures of foreseeable self-aggrandizement rather than a trigger to critical examination of what it means to be a complicated human in a complicated world. Would-be tyrants and aspirational Caesars have a staggering ability to demolish norms and lay institutions waste because they have been yielded that license. They are most certainly dangerous, a rebuke to custom and the rule of law, but have never found in any of them a philosophical challenge. They're instead a disheartening reminder that fascism and an ardor for disruption, a delight in knocking things down, sometimes but not always so that structures can be built in ways that hoard and exclude, are among the most recurringly human patterns that history provides us. Authoritarians and their fellow travelers are not forces of chaos per se, they are those who deploy chaos to accomplish the most predictable goals. To label them monsters is an insult to monsters. A monster's power resides in its ability to spawn alternative narratives, to set story endlessly in motion. Now is the time of monsters. Monsters accompany us, interrogate the human, render identity a constant question rather than a resolved noun. They lead us out of the solitary, the self-evident, and the still. We invoke monsters to reassure ourselves that we have not been abandoned to ourselves in the limited forms and freedoms that autocrats adore. Monsters born of political expedience and self-justifying nationalism are deployed to justify violence, invasion, usurpation, deportation, colonization. But these kinds of monsters reveal themselves inevitably to be humans we have refused to call fellow. Monsters of prohibition police the borders of the possible, and valuing some, forbidding others, but mostly in the service of forming good and compliant citizens. From its position at the limits of knowing, this kind of monster stands as a warning. Monster prohibition prevents wandering and delimits where we can be, but it never works. These kinds of monsters inevitably are revealed as dull props and empty costumes. They're easy to carnivalize since they enjoy so much that makes us human. Even interdiction is a quiet invitation, and that is why tyrants always fail. A world without Caesars is a world where the monster of prohibition is revealed as convivial. Because the monster is a figure of story, like all incitements to narrative, it hasn't any beginning. Likewise, monster studies in no way began with monster theory in 1996, but without doubt enters the historical record with monsters themselves as quickly as the earliest surviving cave paintings, petroglyphs, and masks, in writing with the first clay recordings of famines and floods. The monster was well known in Babylon. The hero of the Odyssey is one of our best investigators of what monsters mean. Could go on and on listing authors throughout history. Some of the ones that came immediately to mind: Marie de France, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, Leslie Fiedler, Henry Dumas, Zora Neale Hurston, John Block Friedman, Bram Stoker, J.R.R. Tolkien, so many. And yet the collaborative project published as Monster Theory, printed by a distinguished university press, gave the discipline an imprimatur, a seriousness that has served as a catalysis. In the 3 decades since its appearance, the volume has invited all kinds of new and intriguing work to roam the world. We've seen it amply at this conference. To what better legacy can a monster aspire? Let me tell you something I think about a lot, because I'm probably at the tail end of my own career, and I see a lot of my colleagues who worry about their academic legacy. But by that, I think what really troubles them is the day will come when their books aren't read anymore and people don't esteem them for their groundbreaking scholarship. And you already set yourself up for misery if that's the measure of what a legacy is. A legacy is what you enable. A legacy is what you have enabled to come. And it has nothing to do with a book being worshipped. If, for example, Monster Theory were in that book from 30 years ago and hadn't changed, we'd have no reason to be in this room right now. The life is in continued citation, reinvention, challenge, disagreement, everything that goes on. And that should be the kind of legacy that anyone should aspire to. Yet, despite the vibrancy of the scholarly work within monster studies undertaken so far, much remains to be imagined. The monster beckons for analyses that foreground science and technology studies, especially around climate change, AI, biotech, surveillance, robots, pandemics, global and intercultural work, more post-colonial and decolonial analysis, digital and virtual realms, social and remedial justice, you name it. All the things that we're seeing more and more these days need to go on. And I want to emphasize, monster studies has never and must never be about self-congratulation. It has to be prospective, future-oriented, and generative. Dream a little. The path we could follow has been worn by the monster's tread. We cannot be sure how long that impress took. The road on which we set forth, unsure who invited us, unsure who follows, is circular, but it doesn't lead back to ourselves. Or better, this labyrinth long ago unlocked itself from time and became a kind of spiral or vortex, where across the shadows you will barely discern, but attend and you will discern an earlier or a future self, seeking or running, chasing while being chased. The monster shows the way. The path the monster treads leads toward enlarged perspective, even when the trek loops into histories we imagined we surpassed. We can't assimilate what keeps rebuking our perspective. We can't theorize in the containers of the merely known, that which will not remain stilled. Monsters traversing their winding trails, heads buried in a book, always reading. Monsters remember what was, what is, whatever fleeting commonality that indeterminate first-person plural affords, might undo or become. History in motion, hazard too restless for totality, monsters endure, bind, hybridize, open, imagine, and instill. We'd be fools to downplay the monster's danger, as we are fools to downplay our own. We are unkind creatures who ought to act better. Long study will reveal to anyone that running from the monster is useless. You won't escape, you can't. You'll stumble and you'll fall. You'll be devoured or engulfed or become your own worst enemy. Run toward the monster. A trail that is a spiral has no outside to which to flee. I've been thinking about monsters for 30 years in a scholarly capacity and for as long as my memory extends as a person in the world. If in my life I've had one realization that seems to me true, it's that the monster elicits a strong emotion that manifests in many ways simultaneously, all of them infectious and magnetic.
To be in the presence of the monster is to be unable to tell terror from laughter, from love. Monsters are our parents, our children, and our fellow travelers. Push them to the farthest margins, hide them, hide from their knowing gaze or disavow their intimacy, but they always return, bearing hard knowledge about limits and shelter, about our place in history and the history of knowing our place. Monsters ask us how we have built our worlds, through what exclusion, at whose expense. They ask us if we love them still. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Thank you so much. I think that this paper that Jeffrey shared with us was a great example of his generosity of spirit and his kindness and his longue durée view of what is going to be necessary to keep this society going. And I think the fact that this conference is so full of joy and love and, oh, thank you. I'm an actor by training, so. I think the reason that this conference is so full of joy and love and generosity of spirit, the reason why we have attracted people who are, just emerging into their careers and also established scholars. In fact, I think we had someone here who was just born recently.
We did,
Yeah. That this is a testament to Jeffrey's enduring influence on the creation of the community, and we thank you for that, Jeffrey. Thank you so much. Yeah. And to me personally, but I won't get into that now. Let's open it up to the floor. Okay, John. Start with John. I saw you, Dustin.
Thank you. Just sort of going back to the origin story, the beginnings of monster theory, what sort of led you to sort of separate out monster studies from adjacent studies like horror, the Gothic, the fantastic, the weird? What was it about monsters in particular that you felt wasn't being addressed in those other areas? And do you now consider monster studies to be a subcategory or what's the opposite of a subcategory? A supercategory? So yeah, just sort of what's the relationship in your mind, both at the beginning and today?
So a lot of the work that became Gothic studies, the new weird, et cetera, was being generated at that time, but there wasn't really a place where we got to know each other. So, Jack Halberstam was working on Victorian Gothic and monsters, but I didn't meet Jack until years later. A lot of Gothic studies is absolutely flourishing right now, and one of the people that has ensured its flourishing is Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock. He was my first PhD student at George Washington University. But he studied with me because he knew about my monster book, and we became friends immediately. And he knew more of what was going on. I was a medievalist. He was working in 19th century studies. So I would say it was of a moment where a lot of really good work was being generated. But it's almost hard to believe. It also comes from a moment 30 years ago when many scholars, especially respectable scholars, would self-describe themselves as allergic to theory. Like, theory is not a thing that you did. You did philology, you did deep dives into text, you close-read poetry, forget all that queer theory, feminism, post-structuralism, Foucault, Bakhtin, like, it was all not stuff that graduate students should be touching. So I think there was a lot bubbling up at the moment, and it's not like I'm not the one who came up with the term monster studies. I think it's Michael that used that as the bigger designation. The reason I chose monster theory from that is that having been trained by people who were allergic to theory, I just wanted to say, like, we're doing some monster theory here. So I think I belatedly came to realize how much more was going on. But when you're early in your career, you're still just looking. And I know this is hard to believe. This is like pre-internet. So you couldn't just like do a Google search and see who was working on what. You had to go to a conference, and you had email, but there was no World Wide Web, really.
Thanks. Dustin?
Have you given any thought to the intersection between monster theory and propaganda studies? Especially, I was thinking of Noam Chomsky's propaganda model of mass media with its necessary common enemy and otherization.
Yeah, I think a lot of good work has been. That isn't the work that I've tended to do, only because I'm less interested in monsterization and dehumanization as historical phenomena. I mean, I certainly do work on them. I have a book on, anti-Semitism and medieval Jews, and the stakes are real and something like that. And I think that work is important to do. I certainly read it. David Livingston Smith's work, I think, is consonant with that. What I have decided to try to do in my work is to never not acknowledge all the terrible things that humans do to each other. Right? That's history, that's reality, is just a part of what we live with. I don't want to be stuck in that, so I want to make sure that I'm offering more affirmative models of what we might become and where we might go. I'm trying to get beyond that a little bit, and I'm more, even though the monster can lead us down the path of fascism, propaganda, dehumanization, people lose their lives by being monsterized. I really, at this point, I'm heavily invested in monsters opening better futures than the one we're looking at the moment. So that's where I've gone with my scholarly energy.
Thanks. Awesome.
Currently finishing out my first draft of my dissertation, and I'm using monster theory to construct a critical archetype for hip hop. I didn't see hip hop on that, so now you can add hip hop to the. So thank you for that. I just wanted to know. I mean, in monster theory, you talk about alien, vampire, and a whole taxonomy of monsters. Since monster theory has turned 30, is there a new clade of monster that you have seen? One that is not just a hybridization, perhaps, of vampire and werewolf, but something, a new other, a new fighter that has entered the arena that we will continue to be wrestling with when monster theory turns 60.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the most tiresome fact about me is, as a medievalist, I don't like to admit that anything is new. I'm like, everything comes from at least 1,500 years ago, right? And so I tend to think, even as most contemporary monsters along their long durational existence, where they keep manifesting as some version of, the undead, the giant, the dragon, the hybrid. It's not to say we don't have really cool new, in 1979, I think, is the first Alien movie. There was no xenomorph until that was launched. That has been profoundly influential, and I think we're at 7 Alien movies and a streaming series. So that's one of the ones. Even to see something like Jaws give rise to this whole sharksploitation genre is pretty amazing too. That stays in our imagination for a long while. But I'd want to think about the question a little bit more. Yeah.
Cool. Did you, Brandon? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was unprepared for how emotionally moving I'd find this. My eyes glazed over 3 times at discussing the promise of community through monsters. In your talk, you mentioned no one owns a monster. Another phrase you said was no community without crossing borders. And I was thinking a little bit about, in the kind of conversations you've had and the kind of spaces you've been in, how people approach or think about as sort of the opposite of the monstrous movement, the idea of roots and fixity. So in terms of certain monsters like La Llorona or the Wendigo, or like what, when authors are like, I want to work with this creature that's not within my cultural tradition, or, when I see something in it which is not coded into the original folklore or stories, like how do we think about that intersection?
Yeah, it's a great question. We do it with care. We also have to admit, and I do truly believe this, right? No one owns a monster. So you can look at a monster in its origin, and it will be specific to a culture, but it will travel. And the minute it starts to travel, it mutates and it becomes something else. This is just a fact of human life. The tomato was introduced to Italy and now is so profoundly part of Italian culture. It's not eternal in Italy, but it becomes its own thing. I think monsters are just those kinds of traveling ideas that one of the reasons why the monster calls us to serious humanistic study is the only way to understand them is to do things like learn languages other than the ones we were born into, learn the cultural parameters of where something arose, get to know that difference, and do it with humility, do it with curiosity, but then follow the monster as it continues to move. I get it, right? We have strong taboos, as we should, about cultural appropriation and doing work and making it ours when it's not ours. We should be careful about doing that. Luckily, most of our scholarly societies have really good guidance around, if we're doing ethnographic work, if we're doing community work, how we foreground all our collaborators. But having said that, these phenomena are complicated, and they'll keep moving whether we follow them or not. Another way of saying this, and I would really want to emphasize it, is like monster theory didn't come like shooting out of my head and I was alone in a room and monster theory came about through some things that were deeply personal, including frustration and a desire for community, but some things that were really exciting to me, like reading other people's work, recognizing the possibilities in the world, being really excited by some of the good cultural studies work of that time, and saying, I want to be part of that. I want to be an intellectual part of that. Here's another way to put it. All of you who've went through several of the presentations today or been here for a couple of days, right? We as a community just generated an entire body of knowledge that's going to catalyze all kinds of ideas across all of us. And, we'll publish it, and I guess we'll own it from a copyright point of view, and whatever, that's how that works. But we should be generous in owning that it came out of community conversations, it came out of the questions we asked each other, it came out of the challenges, it came out of the presentations. It's really work that we are all doing together. There's a way in which, even though if you're a scholar, you have to own things, it's just part of what you're supposed to do, there's a way in which that's actually never true. Right? Scholars and writers are just convergence points for lots of thought, and it's temporary and it moves on to other convergence points.
Great. I see a lot of hands. I saw you, Blake, too, but we'll go here, and then Blake, you're next.
Hi. Is there a way to think of AI as monstrous? I mean, in an old school way, manifesting like the old robot horror or Terminator or something like that, but transforming into something new, especially since now AI is both willing to drive us to suicide and also potentially to murder us. In this recent experiment with the theoretical human named Kyle, who gets locked in the closet.
It sounds like you have not yet embraced our AI overlords.
I'm also wondering how they are and aren't like old divinities, like the Greek gods who functioned with logic beyond human and became monstrous because of it.
Two quick answers to that. I have not done that work, but I know other people are doing it, including some of the presentations at this conference. I've also been reading I'm blanking on the person's name. Young adult author. He wrote a book about young people training to be scythes in a future where we're all immortal. Shusterman. The second one is called Thunderhead, and it really is. I think it's old enough where AI wasn't a thing, but it's about what it's like to live in an AI-controlled world before that moment. There's also I'm blanking. Kim Stanley Robinson's book Aurora, about a spaceship that becomes sentient, and it's like training in AI. It's interesting to me, AI really was prefigured in so much writing that we already have. Another example that I can give to it, so here, I'll put it up here. So there is a Monster Theory 3.0 coming out. It has 24 essays. You'll recognize some of them, some of the contributors. But one of the pieces is by a medievalist who is writing about the intersection between medieval ideas of cannibalism and consumption and AI. So I think that's exactly a good point to go at.
Great, awesome.
Hi, thank you again for your very captivating speech. Very, very grateful for it. The question that I have is, I think as somebody who's gone to this conference for multiple years now, I think one of the most beautiful things about monster studies is that it is so multidisciplinary, and we can really have a space to appreciate different perspectives with a fairly easy vernacular to tap into. I think a lot of us are can take your work and be able to have discussions about it, even if we're not experts in each other's respective fields. I think taking the kind of theoretical approach of monsters being something that is representative of difference, and a lot of us, I say a lot of us kind of speaking generally, but I think there's many of us who arrived at monsters and our interest because of our resonance with them, personal resonances that I think seek, like you said, community. I guess my question is that difference can have multiple connotations, and I think some of the more negative connotations is what leads to the genesis of monsters to begin with. But I feel like there's something kind of melancholic about recognizing my reverence for monsters, but also dreaming of a world where nobody feels like one. So I wasn't sure how you feel about this thing that is human and asks us to look at ourselves in a mirror and recognize that we're always going to have something to get angry at or to be afraid of, that there will always be something negative that is proved not only in the past, but seems to continue and to continue to appear to where it will never fully go away.
Mm-hmm. That is a great complicated way of articulating possible relationships to monsters. Since you asked how I would articulate it, I think for me, the monster makes me feel human in its most complicated way, meaning that one of the things I've learned from monsters is that even though we as humans like to parcel our emotions into descriptive terms, in fact, our emotions don't really care about those terms. I think we have strong feelings and we have less strong feelings. And the strong feeling that the monster elicits is simultaneously desire, which is attraction, fear, and laughter. And that's why, for example, any of you who are fans of horror movies, you find yourself laughing during horror movies as part of the release, but you also find yourself tense, and inevitably there's a love story involved. Like, it's that entire gamut that goes on. What I have found productive in trying to think through the monster is that it makes you have to own all the complexities of what it is to be human, the ways in which we have trouble understanding ourselves. And that's okay. I would rather live in a world where people are still struggling to understand themselves, no matter what point they are in life, and supportive of each as they go through that struggle rather than definitively knowing who they are, what the boundaries are, and how things work. Those people terrify me.
Thanks. That's great. Okay, so hand over here, Bernabe.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I just had a question. In looking back at the 7 theses, do you have a favorite thesis? And do you have a least favorite or a thesis that you're like, oh, that could have been something else or expanded on? Just curious.
Good question.
I knew someone was going to ask the Sophie's Choice question. It's really, I think some of them are a little more poetic than others, and I like the more poetic ones, would be the way I would put it. And I think some of them have been more, they come and they go in their usefulness in time. Let me admit something. I actually don't know where those came from. And I know I wrote them in a notebook, and I know I did them pretty quickly. And they probably captured something that I've been thinking about for a long time. But how they poured out and how they took that language, I'm not 100% sure of. And for redoing the book for Monster Theory 3.0, I've been returning to them. And each one gives me something where I get stuck. Like, why did I use that word? Or what? So the one that I've been stuck on lately is the monster is the harbinger of category crisis. Why do I use the word harbinger? That's a weird word, isn't it? Like, what a really weird word. And who says that? I think I was like in my late 20s. I'm like, what? I don't know where it came from, but then I got obsessed with it. And that's why, if you notice in the talk I gave today, it actually was a thinking through of the etymology of harbinger. Harbinger comes from the same word that gives us harbor or safety. But it's also a herald and an announcer. And in medieval, harbinger was the guy in charge of securing lodging for everyone. It was the person who went ahead. But it's actually made from 2 words. The har is hera, which is the word for an army or band or a force. So it's a very martial and destructive word. And then the second part of it is from Berga, which means a built fortification, a place of safety. So it's got like force and destruction and safety built into it all at once. That's a long way of saying, like, I at no point in my life have really understood myself or why I do the things I do, but I sometimes just get... Here's the thing that I hope is obvious to everyone, and I hope for every humanist in the room is true too. I love words. You know, words are the most amazing inventions. They get stuck in us, they motivate us, and then if you can make a beautiful sentence that starts to guide people out of that, what could be better than that? Like something that implants. So I know I didn't answer your question at all. I don't know that I have a way to answer it, but I will say that I will admit, it took me a long time to start to own monster theory as something that was important to me, because I felt like for part of my scholarly career, I needed to put some distance on it a bit in order to get tenure, be a respected scholar. But it's been really good to come back to. Yeah, it feels like, honestly, it feels like coming home. And one of the things about this gathering, right? It always feels like a harbor, a place of safety, a home for those who want it for a while. And that's what I tend to associate like the more positive possibility granting part of Monsters with.
I personally love Harbinger, so.
As long as we're offering Sophie's choices, you mentioned that you grew up with this deep love of media monsters, and I think many of us came into monster studies because we felt the same way that we grew up loving representations of monstrosity. So I'm wondering, just out of curiosity, if you have any favorite monsters in addition to the giants, and how working in monster theory and monster studies has shaped your relationship to loving monsters or the specific monsters that you've loved.
Plenty. A lot of them having to do with really bad horror films and really bad television series. Got obsessed by different ones. I'll tell you, the ones that stay with me, though, are the ones that like kind of knocked me out of my own perspective. I remember watching in reruns, there's an old show, maybe from the 60s, called Lost in Space, about a family in a flying saucer. And one time they go to a planet and they're in their little, like, it's kind of a hippie van, but it's their space vehicle. And there's a giant that they're going by, and they're like, it takes them forever to go by it. And I know it was a bad special effect, but it's just like, whoa, it's so cool to think that there can be a world where scale works that differently. And like that really hooked me into thinking about giant scale, danger, family, all those things. And, you know, if you've ever seen Lost in Space, it's about a family thrown into space because of a treacherous person who's in the family, smuggled aboard. It's about, you know, like the danger is actually inside. And that really helped me too. But I will say one of the, and I only recently came to realize it by being invited to think about Jaws again. Like that movie, if you watch it again, it's simultaneously scary and cringy because parts of it just don't work very much, especially the mechanical shark. Like it's significantly less scary once the mechanical shark surfaces. But I do remember when I saw it for the first time, I must have been like 12 years old, and I went with some friends to a movie theater that only shows reruns, and I watched it with them. And, you know, like it really did startle me because I wasn't ready for it. But I remember going home that night, and I'm asleep. I had two brothers. I'm at the top of my bunk bed, and I wake up in the middle of the night, and I could swear there was a shark floating in the room coming at me. And I'm just like, what the heck? You know, what's wrong with me? I'm in a room, I'm far from the ocean, and I'm scared because a shark's coming at me. And then I just thought, I'm scared because a shark's coming at me. Like, what is it that that movie did that actually made my brain start to think that a shark could be in my room, and I'm processing it, and all right, you could see I was a really nerdy child, and I probably was overthinking everything, but it always stayed with me. Like, why is it that certain monster narratives implant themselves in our brain in a way that's below cognition? It's an emotional level, and then it resurfaces because clearly it's still in there. There would be a long list, including classic monster movies, you know, Frankenstein, Dracula, werewolves. You name them, I love them all. They're just really fun to watch, and I love the worlds that they opened up.
Fantastic. Okay. I love your Elvira shirt. So.
Hi, so I'm actually an undergrad student in psychology, and I specifically like focusing on developmental psychology, or as I like to call it, the origin story of everybody. And I got into monsters as a little kid, reading comic books, like specifically Spider-Man villain Venom, and also watching David Cronenberg's The Fly way too young. And so I want to know, what importance do you place on the origin of a monster? Because that's always not like where did it originate from, like what culture, but seriously, like how did it become a monster? Because that was always the part that fascinated me when it came to monsters, is how did they become monstrous? Whether it was like what happened in their literal childhood, which turned a character into a monster, or like the catalyst that made them become a monster.
You know, when you put it like that, it makes me realize that I'm actually less interested in those kinds of stories, meaning that I love the monster that comes in without the explanation and doesn't need a backstory. The vampire has just always been a vampire. Like, been in Romania for 1,000 years. This is what they do. Well, having said that, no. So, my favorite monster origin story is Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus, because that monster gets to answer back, and because the creature at every moment is confronting Victor with his insufficiency. You know, that monster demands love that he will never get, can never get, and yet will not stop telling his story, and he's going to make sure that that story gets out there. So that I think those I think that particular narrative can make an origin story completely fascinating, but too often the monster narratives, origins are just a little, they can be a little glib or accidental, or, you know, abusive family leads to X, or pedophilia, leads to X, or like some innate thing leads to X. And the other thing that's fascinating, too, and I'm thinking of things like Freddy Krueger and that origin story, but those narratives live on despite the origin story and have a tendency that once you get the origin story to give you another one. So that, like, you know, it wasn't that murderer, it turns out wasn't the murderer, it was the mother. It was then it keeps backing up. Or, you know, I always think about the Joker in Batman, who gives like 5 different origin stories, all based in trauma. And it's like, forget it. You're not going to get it. I know that's not a good answer to it, but I feel like origin stories can too easily become easy anchors. And even the genre is seldom satisfied with them, so they tend to keep getting rewritten and revisited.
I always tell my students that the least interesting part of a pearl is its origin, right? What's interesting is what happens after the origin.
Oh, that's nice.
The least valuable part. Okay, so I hand over here and then I'll come back, I swear.
So you spoke eloquently in your talk about your own origin story as a scholar and some of your experience of marginalization and isolation because of the topic that you were interested in working on. Given that your positionality in the institution now as a dean, what do you do to ensure that junior scholars in your care don't have that same experience?
Yeah, well, I think the best answer will come from them, but I am dedicated to creating a humanities community, nothing like the one in which I was raised and trained. And that was true not only at George Washington University, where for a while I was chair of the English department. Now it's true for my work as dean. I arrived at ASU at a time when most of the humanists there were feeling demoralized and devalued. And just not getting the signal that the work that they do really deserves celebration. Luckily, 8 years on, I don't think people feel that way. For example, next week is Humanities Week. I think we've got something like 27 different events going. I'm going to be on campus every day from like 8 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. But every event is a celebration of all the cool things our faculty are up to that makes the university have to own the value by publicly celebrating it. I do a lot of that work. I'm also fortunate enough to work at a university where when a junior faculty member arrives, we invest them with adequate research funds, travel funds, professionalization money, and all of that. I work hard to keep that going. And I consider myself a fairly approachable person. I'm not the sort of dean that is interested in telling people why they can't do things, but really interested in trying to figure out how to do new things. And one other asset that I have at ASU, because it's so big, is a Humanities Institute that's very well funded. And every year we fund 5 new faculty-directed initiatives. And they can propose whatever they want as long as they bring a community into it and build something around it. And some of those become long-term sustainable centers and initiatives. So it's something I think about a lot. Here's another way to put it, and for those of you early in your career, I would really give some thought to this. I hope for those of you looking for tenure-track jobs, you get them. For those of you graduate students right now, you sail into the perfect job for you. It can be brutal out there, but I do think there's an obligation among those who actually did make it and got tenure and are really within the system to focus on the others who are in there with them and to make sure that it is a place of welcome and thriving for all. There is an allergy among many of my colleagues toward administrative jobs, and it's looked down as merely functional. We'll get nowhere if that's how we think about it. it's really important to have people in those positions that are working for the good of the community. Otherwise, we see what happens, right? You wind up with someone who's working for their own good, or someone enamored of cost cutting, or someone who's just a company person. Those are not good outcomes. I think about it a lot. Here's another way of saying it. Like when I wrote Monster Theory 30 years ago, it was not because I was like, please, 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 I want to be a dean someday, and this will get me to it. It was more that I wanted a configuration in academia that was more just and inclusive and a better sense of belonging. And I feel like that work has been continuous, whether I'm working as scholar or as administrator.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Okay, Sam, you're next, I promise.
Hi, so first, another thank you for a very mind-blowing talk. And I really like your opinion that monster theory is something for the future. So I'm thinking about different monsters at different positions of our social hierarchy. I'm thinking about Joy James and her thought about competitive, maternal, and the black matrix. It is a kind of monster that you don't have choice to choose you're a monster or not, but you're thrown into the position of a monster when you are born. And there are other monsters like the multitude of Negri Heart, of Antonio Negri and Heart. So this kind of monster is some kind of monster that you can become a monster. So you have the choice. The choice means that you are actually at a more privileged position so that you can choose to resistance, to go to revolution, or you can just choose to stay at your position. So this is not a survival thing comparing to the competitive maternal. So I think there are some kind of different monsters, and their different positions makes their toxic for resistance or revolution different. So I'm wondering, our imagination of these resistance is a kind of a collective resistance of different monsters from different social groups, or we should imagine them fighting on their own, or they are fighting in a more hybrid way that we at our moment cannot imagine because it is something for the future.
I'd say yes to all those things. Right? There is no easy rule of thumb when it comes to monsters where we can make a capacious statement that captures the truth of what's going on. So monsterization is to be placed into a place of struggle. But I think for some people, they've also found it as a place of freedom and solidarity building and building a future that might not be possible otherwise. It's funny, when you were talking about those possibilities, a book I've been thinking about a lot lately because she's about to come to ASU as part of Humanities Week is Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones. And that book is so many great things, but one of it is a book about the transformational power of reading and reinventing the past. Like a volume of Bullfinch's mythology plays a key role in unlocking futures that might not otherwise be unlocked in a time of crisis and despair. And I feel like the monster often gives people that vocabulary or possibility to know that in the past there were people, bodies, whatever, who struggled with, against, and created kinds of outcomes and endings that might be different. There is a part of me that's really obsessed with the relationship between monsters and reading and storytelling and narrative, and I'm still trying to articulate exactly where that is. But I do think, what monsters and stories have in common is that they implant themselves in us, and sometimes in ways that we don't even know, though it behooves us to get to know those ways. They limit things for us if we don't get some distance on it, but they open up possibilities when we do.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Okay, last comment here.
Yeah, thanks so much for this talk, for your thoughts and your work. So, we talk a lot about humans and monsters, the human and the monster and the human. You talked a lot in this talk as well about monster and the humanities. But I know in a lot of your work since Monster Theses, you've thought a lot about non-human ontologies, non-human ecologies. So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the non-human in the monster, the non-human in the monster, how those things work.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm really interested in is that limit between the human and the non-human. It's one of the reasons why I've written about zombies, for example, because, the zombie is the body once the spirit or the personality is gone from it, which here's the thing we know. Once we die, our bodies will rot and they'll become part of an ecosystem and things will live in them and live on them. And the body is not devoid of life. It's just not our life in there anymore. And I had been thinking a lot about the fact that at this moment, we live in a culture where death is mainly invisible. You'd have to actually go to a horror movie to see it. But when a person dies in a hospital, they get whisked away. We don't see the body. We don't have this presence of death. And I think that, for example, zombies give us a way of thinking through the life of the body after death in a way that we're curious about. But I also do think that this part of recognizing that we're human is recognizing that we are not separate from the environmental world in which we're embedded, right? Our bodies go on after us. But our bodies are made of mineral. Right? We are walking minerals. Our spines are made of calcium. We are all kinds of things from the world. Our bodies are biomes of bacteria, you name it. Here's another monster origin story I can tell you, and maybe it would be a good one to end with. I was too young to have seen the original Star Trek when it first came out, but I remember watching it in reruns. I think it was at my aunt's house. And there was one that I saw, I think it was the second Star Trek I ever saw. The first one had the Greek gods in it. I'm like, this thing's cool. The second one was about a mining facility on a distant planet where this rock creature kept killing people. The Horda. The Horda, yeah. Truckers here. My mind was blown when the unraveling of the story is that the Horda wasn't killing people just to kill them. For the first time ever, they introduced the fact that Spock can do this thing called a mind meld. So he could place his hand on the rock and come to realize, it's a mother protecting its eggs. And I just thought, it was really to think that we live in a world where a rock has intentionality, beauty, possibility, creates things. I mean, you talked about pearls, right? The boring part of the pearl is its origin, but pearls are incredible things made by creatures that are of the world of stone and gems. So I've always been fascinated in the ways in which our humanity is an insufficient borderline, and we live in a world where we're kind of always in an interface with an environment. We'll say in closing, and I wish for that reason, and it is not by coincidence that the two areas I work the most in are monsters and environmental literature and theory. I wish we could invite ourselves to care more about this world that we live in. I do think monsters are part of that invitation because they're very much part of this wider ecological system that we're in. But it does seem to me that I know this for a fact. 30 years ago, we knew the environment was in crisis. We knew climate change was happening. We knew all of the things that we're living with right now. We've not lived up to that challenge at all. And I think part of it is that we don't have incentives to do that together. I think finding ways to mobilize community around the things that benefit all of us is going to be our continued challenge in the years ahead. Having said that, being with all of you gives me a lot of optimism that that's going to happen. I feel like this is a community for which all things are possible, including finding in monsters the promise of an unexpected future. So thank you very much for gathering today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you.